Hello, my name is Joe Glavan, and this is a pre-recorded talk for the 2023 virtual meeting of the Society for Mathematical Psychology, entitled Toward the Adaptive Design of General Recognition Theory Experiments, a Control Study. Ashby and Townsend introduced general recognition theory to investigate varieties of independence in perceptual decisions. It can be thought of as a generalization of signal detection theory to multiple dimensions. GRT experiments use a factorial complete identification paradigm where, in the case of a 2x2 design, one of four stimuli is presented on a trial, and the participant must press one of four buttons to indicate which stimulus was presented. From the responses, we can construct a confusion matrix and conduct statistical tests to infer if there was any violation of independence in the participant's perceptual decision process. The GRT framework recognizes three types of independence: perceptual independence, perceptual separability, and decisional separability. Perceptual independence describes the perceptual effects within a single stimulus and can hold or fail for each stimulus, regardless of whether it holds or fails for the other stimuli. Perceptual separability describes the perceptual effects between feature dimensions. It can hold or fail for one dimension with respect to the other, but it does not need to hold or fail in the opposite direction. Decisional separability occurs when the decision bound or criterion is independent of stimulus intensity. It can hold or fail for each dimension, regardless of whether it holds for the other dimension. In theory, any perceptual decision process may be described by some combination of these three types of independence. However, the standard GRT model cannot separately identify decisional separability from perceptual independence and perceptual separability. Therefore, in this work, we assume decisional separability holds and focus on perceptual independence, which can be inferred by testing for report independence, and perceptual separability, which can be inferred by testing for marginal response invariance. As I mentioned previously, the main result of a GRT experiment is a confusion matrix giving the frequencies of each stimulus response pairing. Non-parametric statistical tests can be performed on these frequencies directly to test for report independence and marginal response invariance. Another common analysis technique is to fit a parametric GRT model to the data, which can be illustrated as an equal likelihood contour plot, such as the example on the right side of the screen. Note that the size of each ellipse is not important by itself, but the shape and size relative to the other ellipses is important. Diagonally oriented ellipses indicate correlation and therefore violations of perceptual independence. In our example, perceptual independence holds for these stimuli, but not the others. If the marginal distributions are shown, we can compare corresponding levels to infer perceptual separability. In our example, perceptual separability holds for the first level along the horizontal dimension because these marginal distributions overlap. Perceptual separability fails for the second level because the means of these marginal distributions are offset. On the vertical dimension, perceptual separability fails for the first level because the marginal distributions have different variance, but it holds for the second level because the marginal distributions overlap. Although I will not discuss it further, decisional separability is reflected in the example by the decision bounds running parallel to the coordinate axes. In traditional GRT experiments, pilot testing is used to adjust the levels of each dimension until a stimulus set is determined that is confusable but not impossible to differentiate. Then those same stimuli are used for all participants. Imagine that these are our stimuli. Right now, the task would be too difficult and the participants' responses would be meaningless guesses. But as the disparity increases, the task becomes easier. However, if it is too easy, then the participant will not make enough confusion errors to conduct statistical testing. Not only is it difficult and tedious for the experimenter to stumble upon the sweet spot where discrimination isn't too hard but isn't too easy, but it consumes valuable time and resources. Now let's map these stimuli into response space. No matter how carefully the stimuli are pilot tested, some participants will find them easier to discriminate than intended, producing too few errors to analyze. Or some participants may find them too difficult to differentiate on one or both dimensions. Not only can this issue come about from individual differences between participants, but differences in experimental hardware may impact in online studies or replication attempts. The adaptive approach we introduced at Virtual Math Site 2020 uses a psychophysical algorithm to adapt each stimulus level to each individual participant. It requires no additional pilot testing and takes approximately 7 minutes at the beginning of the experimental session. The psychophysical algorithm is Bayesian, so the posteriors from one session can be saved and used as priors in a future session or to construct group-level hyperpriors for related studies. The strength of the adaptive method comes from assuming an underlying measurement model where perceptual independence, perceptual separability, and decisional separability hold in full. This allows the multivariate response probabilities to be decomposed into the product of marginal cumulative density functions, which can then be fit simultaneously using parallel adaptive procedures. Each adaptive procedure fits two parameters for its underlying cumulative density function, which respectively correspond to the location of the decision bound and the distance between the stimuli and perceptual space. These results are from our 2020 presentation where we tested the adaptive method with 8 classes of simulated participants, each of which represented a particular permutation of the possible combinations of independence and separability. Each class of participant was simulated for 100 runs, where each run consisted of 100 adaptive trials followed by 1,000 GRT trials. The y-axis reflects the null hypothesis rejection rates of the subsequent tests of report independence and marginal response invariance. We observed high rates of rejection for the appropriate tests of the stimuli or dimension on which the respective independence or separability was violated, and relatively low rates of rejection everywhere else, demonstrating that our adaptive method can efficiently recover subjects who violate perceptual independence and/or separability, despite the fact that the underlying measurement model assumes that perceptual independence and separability hold. Our next step is to conduct a validation study with human participants, comparing the adaptive method to the traditional pilot testing approach. Each experiment will have the same basic design, a short preliminary block followed by a longer main block. The adaptive experiment will use the preliminary block to adapt stimulus levels, while the participants will be given the opportunity to familiarize themselves with the stimuli and practice during the preliminary block of the traditional experiment. Each experiment will have 2 between subjects conditions that use either separable or integral stimuli. The separable stimuli dimensions are the size of a circle and the orientation of its diameter. The integral stimuli dimensions are the saturation and brightness of a cyan rectangle. Our hypotheses are that we will find more variability and accuracy across participants with the traditional method than with the adaptive method due to individual differences. In both experiments, we expect to find more violations of marginal response invariance in the integral condition than in the separable condition, but we expect the difference in violations to be more consistent in the adaptive experiment than in the traditional experiment. Since the traditional approach will act as the control experiment in this validation study, we intentionally ran it first. This creates the fairest comparison of the old and new approaches by eliminating the possibility that knowledge about the population's psychophysical parameters gained from running the adaptive condition will influence the pilot testing procedure. Since the initialization of the adaptive procedure will not depend on the results of the traditional experiment, running the experiments in this order will reduce bias when comparing the efficacy or efficiency of the 2 approaches. 20 undergraduate students from UTSA participated in the experiment, 10 in each of the separable and the integral conditions. They received 160 practice trials with feedback, followed by 1,000 main test trials. Each trial consisted of a uniformly random onset between 0 and 1,000 milliseconds, followed by the presentation of one of the 4 possible stimuli for 250 milliseconds, and then a white noise mask for 250 milliseconds. The participant was instructed to respond by pressing one of 4 keys that corresponded to the stimulus presented. Here's a demonstration of the separable condition. I have removed the mask from these examples to improve visibility. Here's a demonstration of the integral condition without the mask. On the left is participants' accuracy by stimulus in the separable condition. On the right is participants' accuracy averaged across stimuli. The dashed line indicates the 75% accuracy criterion we targeted, which 3 of the 10 participants approximated. 5 participants were more accurate than our criterion, and 2 were much worse. Here's participants' accuracy in the integral condition. 4, maybe 5 participants performed near the targeted 75%. 1 or 2 participants were more accurate than our criterion, and 4 were much worse. Together with the results from the separable condition, these results reflect the individual differences we expected. Here are the results of the tests of marginal response invariance in the separable condition. The null hypothesis of perceptual separability was rejected for 1 to 4 participants across each stimulus level. We use the R package MDSDT to fit parametric GRT models to each participant's responses. The first thing to note in the separable condition is that the last participant could not discriminate the stimuli along the orientation dimension. The second noteworthy feature is that the second subject appears to have mistakenly reversed the orientation response mapping for large stimuli. These response distributions actually belong to the opposite stimulus quadrants, which is why when I highlight which pairs of marginal distributions violated the invariance assumption, the labeling of participant 2 might appear misplaced. Recoding this participant's responses does not change the number of null hypothesis rejections. Here are the results of the tests of marginal response invariance in the integral condition. The null hypothesis of perceptual separability was rejected for 4 to 6 participants across each stimulus level. Thus, we observed more violations in the integral condition than in the separable condition, but perhaps we might have expected more violations with integral stimuli. Here are the fitted GRT models for the integral condition. The first thing to note is that participant 7 was unable to differentiate any of the stimuli, and participants 8 and 10 were unable to discriminate stimuli along the saturation dimension. Here I have highlighted the marginal response distributions where invariance, and therefore perceptual separability, was rejected. Here are the results of the tests of report independence in the separable condition. The null hypothesis of perceptual independence was rejected for 1 to 6 participants across each stimulus level. Returning to the fitted GRT models, here are the stimuli where there's violations of perceptual independence were observed. Here are the results of the tests of report independence in the integral condition. The null hypothesis of perceptual independence was rejected for 2 to 4 participants across each stimulus level. Returning to the fitted GRT models, here are the stimuli where those violations of perceptual independence were observed. In summary, as we hypothesized, more violations of marginal response invariance were observed in the integral condition than in the separable condition, 19 to 11 respectively. We also observed individual differences as expected, with 1 participant unable to discriminate orientation in the separable condition and 3 participants unable to discriminate 1 or more dimensions in the integral condition. We anticipate running the adaptive experiment with human participants in the fall of this year. We will again recruit 10 participants for each of the separable and integral conditions. Unlike the control experiment, participants will never receive feedback. Instead, the first 16 trials of the preliminary block will use extremely different, easy to discriminate stimuli to familiarize the participant with the experimental paradigm. These trials may also be used to initialize the adaptive procedure. The 16 extreme trials will be followed by 144 adaptive trials, yielding 160 total trials in the preliminary block, which matches the number of trials in the preliminary block of the previously presented control experiment. And finally, 1,000 main test trials, which again matches the control experiment. In conclusion, we have presented the results of a control experiment, which constitutes half of a human validation study that was inspired by a simulation study presented at Cite 2020. The results are optimistic in that they align with our hypothesized expectations to the extent that we can evaluate our hypotheses so far without having conducted the adaptive experiment yet. With that in mind, let's revisit our original hypotheses. We did find individual differences in variable accuracy with the traditional approach, but how that compares to the adaptive approach remains to be seen. We did observe more violations of marginal response invariance in the integral condition than in the separable condition. But whether the difference in violations will be more consistent in the adaptive experiment than in the traditional experiment remains to be seen. Finally, we have established the method and design of the adaptive experiment and look forward to sharing those results with you in the future.